Welcome inside Appalachia. I'm Mason Adams. Old-time music jams aren't just fun. They're good for your mental health.
It's community, and it's through music, and it's uplifting, and it's just so amazing.
The opioid epidemic has changed how we talk about addiction in Appalachia. But it's not America's only drug crisis.
It might still be true that meth is more common in rural places, but it's really a problem in all of our major cities, too.
Every year, hundreds of people observe Bridge Day by parachuting off the 876-foot-tall new River Gorge Bridge. But not just anyone can do it.
Well, generally, to become a base jumper, you start by learning how to skydive, so jumping out of airplanes.
You'll hear these stories and more this week inside Appalachia. Welcome inside Appalachia. I'm Mason Adams. Human beings have used music to alter our moods for, well, practically forever. Lullabies soothe children to sleep. We play fight songs to get hyped during games. And music connects us to spiritual life. But there are other benefits too, which Folkways reporter Liz Paul explored when she visited a couple in Athens, Ohio, who host a weekly jam session out of their home.
In the middle of a cozy living room in Athens, Ohio, the furniture is moved out to create a circle for 6 musicians.
My name is Hillary Burhans, and I have been playing banjo for like 50 years.
Musicians Hillary and Mark Burhans love hosting their weekly old-time jam session.
I live in the town where I met my husband in high school, and kind of had a crush on him because he played the fiddle, and I thought, well, I'll play the banjo. But I quickly learned to love banjo for its own sake.
For the past 4 years, Hillary's old-time jam session has been thriving. This particular group of musicians came together during COVID, and they've stayed together for a reason you may not think of immediately: for their mental health. Here's bass player Julie Ellman.
It's community, and it's through music, and it's uplifting, and it's just so amazing. And I think a lot about how we started this during the pandemic, and it was a sanity saver, I think, for all of us.
It certainly has been for Caitlin Krause, an Athens, Ohio musician who also happens to be a music therapist.
This builds off of there's the social and community aspect that people have mentioned, but I think for me too, it's a time at the end of what's usually a busy work day where just kind of emotionally it helps me to zone out and relax in a way, and kind of while I feel connected to everyone here, also kind of transport somewhere else for a little while. And so for me, it's always old-time music has also done that. There's the social connection, but also the sort of inward connection.
Yeah, that's Mark here.
This is Mark Burhans, Hillary's husband and the cute fiddle player she fell in love with at the beginning of the story.
That's a good point. The zoning out part of it is really good, and I can see how it would be really good for you
For a guitar,
to be
for sure.
You deal with so much stress all day long
Other
in your
people's
job,
stress.
and just sit there and just pound away on the guitar.
One especially great thing about old-time jams is you can be a beginner musician and be welcomed into the fold. Hillary Burhans explains.
Everybody who attends our jam is at a different sort of stage in their musical progression. And one of the things that I love about the inclusivity of old-time music is that a bunch of people who are at different places in their musical progression can happily sit down together and play a tune.
There's a wealth of research literature showing the benefits of active music making and group music making.
To get a better understanding of the science behind the mental health benefits of jam sessions, I enlist the help of music therapist Cheyenne Mize.
in that research, we see evidence of enhanced social and emotional and cognitive well-being, including improvements in concentration and memory, reports of improved mental health and confidence, everything to a sense of purpose and connectedness, and even protection against stress and depression.
Even though we live in an age where technology allows us to be easily in touch, Cheyenne points out that playing music together provides a more tangible type of connection.
You know, we're learning a lot more about loneliness and the devastating effects that loneliness has on an individual. And, you know, we all need more opportunities to connect to other people.
Back at the jam session, Hillary couldn't agree more.
Well, I'm sure it's improved my mental health to be involved in a weekly old time jam session. I mean, you can't go through life alone. I think I'm happier and healthier. I mean, it's stress reducing just to play on your own. But I think everybody needs to feel like they're just sort of hooked up with other people.
And that's just what Monday nights at the Burhans feels like. Welcomed arms of community and music. For Inside Appalachia, I'm Liz Paul in Athens, Ohio.
That story is part of our Folkways reporting project, which covers arts and culture in the region. You can find dozens more Folkways stories at our website, wvpublic.org. When we talk about addiction, a lot of us think about opioids. An unchecked tide of prescription drugs like OxyContin ushered in a devastating epidemic. Public health officials are still trying to get a handle on it, but in the meantime, the national conversation about drugs has turned to treatment, recovery, and harm reduction. But along with opioids, there's another drug still circulating in communities. It rose to prominence in the 1990s, never really went away. That's methamphetamine, or meth, a powerful stimulant that can be manufactured in people's homes. The U.S. cracked down on the sale of ingredients used to make meth, and labs largely dried up. But the ways people make meth have evolved. That history is the topic of a new podcast called Home Cooked. It's produced by The Daily Yonder, a news site in Whitesburg, Kentucky that covers rural America. Here's a bit from the podcast trailer.
My name's Tim. I was a meth addict for probably, 15 years, maybe a little bit more.
Were there any big changes that you noticed over the 15 years that you were using?
A couple big changes. I would say, the price on it would always get lower and lower. Made it more abundant. Also, a lot more people started doing it. A lot of people was doing just weed or doing coke or something like that. And then next thing you know, they wasn't doing anything else but meth at all.
Home Cooked is hosted and produced by Olivia Weeks, a reporter based in Southern Illinois. Olivia Weeks, thank you so much for coming on Inside Appalachia today.
Thanks so much for having me.
I remember meth because it exploded into the national consciousness in the early 2000s, just as I was entering the media business. But I've heard a bunch of meth stories recently, both in the news and from friends who are dealing with people on meth. How has methamphetamines changed over the last 20 years?
Yeah, so that's sort of the starting point of the podcast, which is just that, we're all really, I think, familiar kind of culturally with these stories from the early 2000s. I grew up in a small town. There was a lot of conversation all the time when I was a little kid about, oh, that's a meth lab house. Oh, they're cooking meth out in those woods, like that kind of stuff. And I think that kind of fell off of everybody's radar in the later 2000s and the 2010s in some places. And then around 2018, you start seeing this just flood of news stories that's like, meth is back and it's not your neighbors cooking it anymore. That's a St. Louis Post-Dispatch headline that always sticks in my head because that's like really the formula of this new kind of news article that started coming out in 2017, 2018. Part of it is a little bit silly because meth never disappeared in that time period between sort of the early 2000s meth lab explosions era and today. But I also see why it got so much media attention starting in the late 2010s because a transition really happened where over the course of the 2010s, this vast free market of drug traffickers and producers in Mexico got really good at making methamphetamine really cheaply and at transporting it into the United States. That's in a landscape of meth getting really difficult and pretty expensive to produce here domestically. That imported meth really just sort of took over the whole national methamphetamine economy. So instead of being this sort of weird drug that people would make in their barns, and it's very like locally specific and the recipes get passed from person to person, like it has this kind of folk culture around it in the early 2000s. And then it really transitions into this more traditional drug that's being trafficked along pretty traditional drug supply chains, kind of the way that cocaine is, or one of those other less mythologized drugs or differently mythologized drugs from different eras.
Yeah, it's interesting how drugs and the mythology of them attaches to specific areas. So methamphetamine is associated with rural areas and even with Appalachia to some degree. Is that just pure myth?
There are two questions there. One is meth's association with rural, and one is meth's association with Appalachia. And I think the answers are pretty different. There is some real factual basis for methamphetamine's outsized popularity in rural places, especially in the 90s and early 2000s. Back then, meth was largely produced domestically. It was largely produced just kind of by groups of people in the kitchen or, in the barn or whatever. When you're producing meth in the US, you really want some wide open space to do that because it's a process that smells pretty bad. You don't want your neighbors watching you. And also there's this sort of association with the countryside because anhydrous ammonia, which is a farm fertilizer, is obviously much more common in agricultural places, sparser places. And so people were able to steal anhydrous ammonia from farmers more easily if they lived in the country, or also they just probably had easier access to the farm supply store. So there was this real kind of rural association. And also, I mean, just the usage rates were higher for many, many years, and still I think probably are slightly higher in rural places as compared to the rest of the US. Now, the rural association, makes sense, especially in the Midwest. That's where that sort of mom and pop lab problem of the early 2000s was really concentrated. And it makes sense that meth picked up that rural association. It makes progressively less sense as time goes on, and especially today. It might still be true that meth is more common in rural places, but it's really a problem in all of our major cities too. Now, when it comes to Appalachia, it's interesting. I think that places on the East Coast or Eastern United States always had a smaller meth problem than in the Midwest and the West. And that's for some complicated sort of supply chain reasons. The problem was always kind of slower to take off. Now, that's not to say that there was no meth in these places. Certainly, all throughout small towns in Appalachia, there definitely was meth in the heyday. People could get the recipe online. There was no stopping people from making it, but it didn't quite take off in the way that it took off in the Midwest.
What accounts for that connection to Appalachia then? Is it just people sort of linking rural America and Appalachia and kind of lumping them together when there's really distinct differences in this case?
Yeah, I think that's part of it. There was this very popular and sort of widely known campaign that started in Portland, Oregon, against methamphetamine that was called the Faces of Meth campaign. And it was this sheriff taking pictures of people who had been arrested on meth-related charges who were looking pretty rough. And he would basically put up a photo of them early in their meth use or their first arrest, and then a photo of them later on in their lives when drug use or whatever lifestyle choices had taken its toll. And I think a lot of people don't need me to explain it to them. The images just come to mind. But there's been really good analysis of the Faces of Meth campaign and the way that sort of hit on hillbilly stereotypes like toothlessness. It's really nasty stuff, and I don't even really want to talk about it because it's I don't think that this connection actually makes any sense. But I think that those images, especially to urban people, read as, oh, those are hillbillies, even though the photos are of people from Portland, Oregon. And so I think that those images are honestly responsible for a lot of the connection to the countryside. And I think Appalachia automatically gets lumped in with that. And it automatically hits on a kind of hillbilly, hill people stereotype.
The podcast covers the 50-year history of meth. Where is methamphetamine in 2024, and what do you think the future holds?
we're in a pretty scary place right now. Methamphetamine and fentanyl are both produced in really high quantities in Mexico, and those supply chains have sort of merged in some ways. Some people call them twin epidemics. A lot of people have started using the term synthetic drug crisis because you can't really talk about methamphetamine without talking about fentanyl, or vice versa. Overdose deaths are the highest they've ever been, both for fentanyl alone, both for methamphetamine alone, and for fentanyl and meth combined. The concomitant use of those drugs is really, really common now. Addiction has always been one of the dangers of methamphetamine. And also in the early 2000s, like meth lab explosions and the interactions with toxic chemicals, that kind of thing. Those were major risks of methamphetamine use back in the day. Those aren't really risks anymore. The risk today is fentanyl contamination. That's a big problem. It's a scary situation. And then at the same time, I think that there's been in recent decades a general turn against mass incarceration as a solution, simply because it hasn't worked and because a lot of people have been really negatively affected by that system. I think right now, with really high levels of homelessness and addiction and overdose, there might be a backlash against that sort of positive turn against mass incarceration, and that's kind of scary to me. But I think that in general, people are more open-minded to strategies like harm reduction, more open-minded, trying to be more compassionate to people who use drugs. I think that's positive. I think part of that is that the opioid epidemic, that sort of stereotypical narrative of like the blue collar man who got hurt at work and then got addicted to opioids by no fault of his own and then wound up using heroin and on and on. That narrative that sort of took hold of the public imagination, I think, did some good for people who use drugs, because it just showed one possible way in which a person who's really easy to empathize with could wind up addicted to drugs. And so I don't know. I think there are positive movements. I think people are more open to harm reduction, clean needles, fentanyl test strips, that kind of thing. So that's positive. But I think overwhelmingly it's a really scary drug market right now. I think I would tell people that you'd be surprised where you can find a harm reduction organization to get involved with, even if you live in a small town or a rural place. Like, it's very possible that there's someone out there doing the work, trying to keep people alive, even while they're in the throes of addiction. Look out for that and look out for ways to get involved.
And look out for each other. Olivia Weeks, thank you so much for coming on Inside Appalachia and speaking with us.
Thanks so much for having me.
Home Cooked is now available wherever you get podcasts. Recovery from addiction is possible. For help, you can call the free and confidential treatment referral hotline, 1-800-662-HELP, or visit findtreatment.gov. Coming up, a story about coming out, getting kicked out, and coming home anyway. That's after the break. You're Inside Appalachia. I'm Mason Adams.
Support for Inside Appalachia is provided by Concord University, offering 31 bachelor-level degrees and 6 master-level degrees for students of any age. More information at concord.edu.
Writer Jonathan Corcoran grew up in Elkins, West Virginia, the youngest son of a stonemason and a house cleaner. Corcoran hid his sexuality through high school, but when he was in college, his mother discovered his secret. She disowned him and told him to never come back to West Virginia. She died in 2020 during the worst of the pandemic. They never reconciled. Now Corcoran teaches writing at New York University, and he's written a book that explores grief and his relationship with his mother. Producer Bill Lynch spoke with the author, who began with a reading.
I'm going to read today from a little section in the 4th chapter of the book. This is a book about when my mother disowned me for being gay. But after she did this, it wasn't just a clean cut. She called me. There was a time where she called me every week, every couple of weeks, early in the morning, she would say some kind of vile things, some strange things. I got the sense that she couldn't let me go. And so I would wake up to her phone calls. They would last for maybe a minute or two, and then she'd disappear into the air. She was a monster then, but like all monsters, she was vulnerable. Every 10th call, she would slip up. She'd forget the script. She'd ask, "Who are you?" She'd ask, "What happened to you?" Her voice came through the phone like the sounds of a ghost. And though I was raw, and though I'd been stripped of dignity and stabbed with her vitriol, though her words salted my heart to the point where I thought it had shriveled to nothing, there was a little bit of something still pumping there. I had only ever wanted to thrive. "I'm me," I'd say. "I'm the same John you gave birth to. I'm the same John you've always known." I'd speak that tiny truth, and for a short time, that grounding thought was the only thing of which I was sure, though time would pass, and then I'd question even that. We would listen to each other breathing, maybe crying. We would sit there for 5 or even 10 minutes, and out of the static, I'd render her tired body, her dyed hair, her face against the pillow. We were connected by airwaves and genetics and instinct. And then I would hear the phone click. For so long, she was the one who wielded the power. For so long, I continued to pick up the phone.
Pretty intense.
Yeah.
With something like this, I can't imagine it was easy sifting through your life and also as well as your mother's history. So what was it like going back and looking through your personal history and putting it down onto a page?
So, the publisher has been calling this biography nestled inside a memoir. It ends up being as much her story as my own story. It's not an easy process to go and find those details. This is about my late mother. She passed away, and I had this realization that you can't fact check the dead, right? You can't ask them questions anymore. So you're mining both your memories, you're mining your emotions, and you're looking for these little hints of things that are going to spark some remembrance. I found things like her marriage certificate. I found things like old photo albums. I found things like letters from friends. It was painful going through this process. It's about what happened to us. It's about who I was. It's about why she did what she did. Because I also began writing this book after she passed away, the book began to mirror my grieving process in some ways, I think. It becomes a sort of grief memoir. You can see that in the structure. I go back and forth in time. Something triggers a memory, and then I'm back to my childhood. Something triggers another memory, and then I'm back to a moment sitting with her in the city park in Elkins, West Virginia, thinking about the things that have happened. It was hard, but ultimately, by the end of this book, I felt like it was a healing process.
Talk about growing up in Elkins.
Yeah, I have such fond memories of that West Virginia and that place and time. We were street urchins. We didn't have hovering parents. And so I remember being 5, 6, 7, 8 years old and our parents shooing us out the door. I would run down my little street. I lived not far from downtown Elkins, and I'd meet up with my friends. One day we would traipse through the woods. One day we would be running around the downtown. There was always some mystery we would uncover. This was before the age of the internet. And so there was a lot of creativity that we shared running around those downtown streets in Little Elkins, West Virginia. Those memories are also, some of them are mirrored by this growing sense that I was different also, right? So I think I realized from a pretty early age that I was gay. And so my life would begin it would begin to be a process of both trying to find ways to express that, but also ways to hide that to protect myself. I had the sense that my family was never going to accept me for who I was. And so I would find secret ways, secret friends, secret people that I could share these facts with and sort of begin to grow into my identity.
Your life as a writer, leaving Elkins and going to Brown. From a street urchin bumping around in the woods to Brown seems like a pretty big jump.
Yeah, I never would have gotten to Brown, first of all, if I hadn't had a couple helping hands that got me there. My mom cleaned houses for a living, and my dad was a construction worker. He was a stonemason. He laid half the blocks of bricks in the downtown of Elkins. I was a first generation college student, and when it was coming time for me to apply to college, I thought, I'll go to WVU, I'll go to Fairmont, I'll go to one of these places. They're great institutions. But then this former Elkins High School graduate came into an AP English classroom one day and she said, John, you're a smart kid, aim higher. And that was just one of the many times in my life that somebody told me I should aim higher. And that sort of messaging pushed me over the edge. And I got into Brown. When I got to Brown, that was a whole new education. Growing up, the child of a house cleaner and a construction worker, and suddenly I'm around, Wall Street banker children. I'm around literal European royalty were in my class. I'd never seen anything like that. It was this exposure to this kind of wealth and this kind of world that I'd only barely heard of, that I'd seen in movies. And suddenly that was all around me. I tried to fit in. I tried to be like them. I made so many friends, but by the end of the time I left college at Brown, I left with $15,000 in credit card debt because I was trying to keep up with these students. Back in those days, we didn't have this sort of discussion openly about financial literacy. I didn't know what I was doing. So that was one part of Brown. The other part of Brown was that it really was a creative awakening for me. That's the positive side for sure. I took these wonderful classes, including this one class that sticks in my brain. It was called Life Writing. And I'd been a journalist in my summers off from Brown. I worked at the Intermountain newspaper back in Elkins. I was this young little kid running around at the city council meetings, asking pointed questions because I didn't know any better. Nobody told me about small town politics. I just jumped right into it. I have a funny story about my time as a reporter back in Elkins. The strangest case I ever got assigned was a land dispute. I was maybe 17 or 18 years old, and my editor sent me out to this land dispute where two men were arguing over a property line. One guy was literally in the process of paving a road over what the other man thought was his property. The other man came out with a shotgun and said, "Get off my land." I was this young little punk reporter with a camera, and I took a photo of what was going on. And the man with the shotgun said, "If you run this story in tomorrow's Intermountain, I'm going to shoot you." Well, they ran the story, and for a week at the Intermountain, we were scared I was going to die. Luckily, I didn't. But I got to Brown, and I accessed a different part of my creativity. I moved away from journalism a little bit and dove deep into telling these life stories that really attracted me. I was talking about things that were just sort of budding up in my consciousness, questions about, looking back at West Virginia, what it meant to stay or to go, what it meant to create a place in a changing region, what it meant to decide to stay and make a place better versus taking your talents elsewhere. Those were the kinds of questions that I began to grapple with. And many of those questions would begin to form the first book I wrote, The Rope Swing Stories, a story collection, which is loosely based on my experience growing up in Elkins.
If you thought about if you had stayed, if you had gone to WVU and, I don't know, majored in journalism or majored in English or who knows what?
I think a lot about what my life in West Virginia would have been like. But part of the problem that happened to me was that when I was disowned, my mom told me, not just you're no longer part of this family, but you can't come back to West Virginia anymore. She told me to stay away, that this place was lost to me. And I think that that's something that people don't realize with family estrangement. You don't just lose blood, family, and kin. You lose towns, you lose people, you lose geographies. I kept thinking about those mountains. I was in Rhode Island, this flat ocean state. The largest mountain is, I think, 100 and something feet. And I kept thinking about my childhood going up and down the Allegheny Mountains, right? I kept thinking about my childhood right outside of Elkins is the Monongahela National Forest, and how many times I had been trouncing around in those streams and running through those forests. That was my birthright, and that birthright had been cut off from me. I would fantasize about this alternative West Virginia life. And in my head, I would have stayed and become an editor in a newspaper or a politician. Maybe I'd be a senator or maybe even the governor. I used to fantasize about these things. I had gone to Brown, right? The whole world was opening up for me. But this estrangement, this disownment that happened between when my mother cut me out of her life really changed the course of my life. It sort of cut off a lot of those opportunities. It took me a long time for me to heal my relationship with West Virginia, to heal my understanding that this place was more than just my relationship with her, right? People get so woven into the fabric of the geographies of our childhood, right? When I looked back at West Virginia, I began to only see my mother and her presence hovering over them. Years later, my relationship with West Virginia has been repaired. And when I come home now, I generally have these really positive, sort of affirming experiences. And I realize in some ways how much that place has changed since I've gone.
I've wondered first if you had gotten back recently and what it was like for you to visit West Virginia now, maybe to visit those old stomping grounds.
I was scared out of my boots to come back to West Virginia with this book. It's a memoir. It's my life story. It's real. It's a small place, West Virginia. So you know that somebody's going to know the characters in this story in many ways, right? The people are going to know my mom. They're going to know her relationships, her friends. I wasn't sure what people would think about it. So I went from Pittsburgh to Buchanan to Elkins and then Charleston. Obviously, Elkins was the one I was really scared about. That's the hometown reading. And you know what happened? When I showed up, there's a new bookstore in Elkins called Alexandria on Main. They literally rolled a red carpet out for me when I came to town. It was amazing. I march into town. I'm getting ready for this event, not just one event. We had to do 2 events in the same evening because there was so much demand. If that's not a homecoming, then I don't know what is, right? And so here was this red carpet. I walked through the doors. That reading in Elkins, I saw my 1st grade teacher. I saw my 3rd grade teacher. When I was a kid in high school, I was lucky and got to take a college class at Davis and Elkins College, and a college professor I'd had was there. There were friends from my life. There were book clubs in town reading the story. I couldn't dream this up, right? That trip back home on this book tour, it just felt, I keep coming back to that word, it just felt like a homecoming.
The book is No Son of Mine by Jonathan Corcoran. Jonathan, thanks a lot.
Thank you, Bill. It's been a pleasure being on your show. And as always, I love talking to the people of West Virginia and Appalachia. That's my home.
No Son of Mine is available through the University Press of Kentucky. Walk outside and you hear a world of sounds, everything from birds to traffic and construction. But have you ever stopped to really listen to what you're hearing? 2 researchers at Virginia Tech are exploring what scientists can learn about the natural world through soundscapes. Radio IQ's Roxy Todd reports.
In downtown Blacksburg, the sound of birds and cars blend together. A few miles away on a hiking trail, hear how the sounds change. Gabrielle Ripa is a graduate student at Virginia Tech. She explains soundscapes are like landscapes you hear.
So the frogs, the birds, the insects.
Ripa and another researcher, Grace O'Malley, are exploring what changes in a soundscape when invasive plants take over an area. Sometimes these plants, like autumn olive, have berries and bring new birds or mammals. Or the flip side can happen, O'Malley explains.
There's no longer food or resources there for animals, so they no longer occupy those areas.
Spaces become quieter if birds or insects leave, or if, for example, kudzu muffles the sounds that were there before. O'Malley and Ripa processed hours of soundscapes using a computer program to isolate different types of sounds. They say more of this type of research could help us better understand how invasive species impact native plants and animals, and what changes to the ecosystem they bring. I'm Roxy Todd.
Radio IQ is a service of Virginia Tech. It's a few months off, but thrill seekers are already planning for Bridge Day at the new River Gorge in Fayetteville, West Virginia. Each year, dozens of base jumpers leap from the 876-foot tall bridge, pull their parachutes, and aim for the banks of the river below. High school students Dylan Neal and Nella Fox of the Fayette Institute of Technology got curious about how to become a Bridge Day base jumper. So they talked with an expert. Here's their interview with base jumper Marcus Ellison.
Bridge Day is an annual event that takes place every third Saturday in October at the new River Gorge Bridge. The main highlight of the event is the base jumpers who jump off the bridge and safely parachute to the bottom. We wanted to find out how to become a base jumper at Bridge Day, so we interviewed Marcus Ellison.
My part in making Bridge Day happen is I'm the base jumping coordinator for all of the jumpers. So part of what that entails is getting all the jumpers to sign up, and then basically just distributing all the information that they need so that they can show up to Bridge Day on time, arrive at the location where we have jumpers headquarters, and then make sure everybody knows where they're supposed to be, what they're supposed to be doing, all the safety information that they need, and basically just corralling all the jumpers to come to Bridge Day and have a pretty much seamless good time.
How do you become a jumper? Like, what is that sign-on process?
So for me, well, generally to become a base jumper, you start by learning how to skydive. So jumping out of airplanes, which is what I did. So typically, people who teach base jumping courses won't accept you into their base jumping course until you've had at least 200 skydives. Okay. And so you start by learning how to skydive, and that what that does is get you familiar with the parachute system as a whole. And once you start learning that equipment and gear, and as you progress through that, then someone will take you under their wing and teach you how to base jump.
How do you become a jumper at Bridge Day?
Once you have established yourself in the community as a known safe jumper, and someone has accepted you into their base jumping course, that's sort of your first ticket into becoming a Bridge Day jumper. Our community is fairly small. There's less than 5,000 people in the world that actively do this. And so we know who they are, right? And so we also know when somebody comes into our world and tries to lie to us. Because people do this every year. They come in and say, oh, I've done all this training, blah, blah, blah. And you go, well, where did you do it? And they tell you, and then you go to that place because you know everybody there, and they go, yeah, we don't know this person. And we have to vet every single person that comes through because it happens every year. People try to deceive us. They think they can cut corners. And Bridge Day is a technical base jump. The landing area is small. You have flowing white water down there. There's a lot of dangers. So that's kind of the second step to becoming a Bridge Day base jumper.
Could you describe the experience of base jumping?
Yeah, man. Base jumping is I still struggle to find the words to describe it because it's such a unique and exhilarating experience. People ask me all the time what it is that I do this for and why I do it, and it's mostly about the experiences I get to share with the other people. But there are these moments. You're standing on the edge of something huge, and normally that's pretty crazy. But you put a parachute on your back that is a life-saving device. A piece of gear that you can trust, and and it sort of changes that perspective of standing on the edge of something tall is wild, right? It now becomes a little bit more normal, right? Because you have a piece of gear that can save you. So there's this moment of freedom where your feet are touching the platform, and then there's that precise moment when you're not touching anything anymore. And there's this moment of lightness and freedom and escape where nothing else matters other than what's happening right there in that moment. And all you have to do is perform that jump. That's the only thing that matters in the world. Nothing else. No job, no money, girlfriends, whatever. Nothing else matters. It's just that. And that is an incredibly good feeling. And I think that's why a lot of people come and continue to do it year after year.
Would you recommend base jumping?
Absolutely. Yes, I would 100% recommend base jumping to anybody, within reason, obviously. Mm-hmm. And like we spoke about before, you got to go through the proper training to get there. the steps that I told you about to train to base jump, I went through those same steps. I started skydiving in 2007. It was actually on my mother's birthday when I made my first jump. September 29th, 2007 was my first skydive. Yeah, I would recommend it to anybody. It's not for everybody, but I would recommend it to anybody.
What does Bridge Day mean to you?
I'm from here. I grew up here, went to Oak Hill High School, born and raised. And, I'm I am the first only true born and raised Fayette County local to jump on Bridge Day. And so that is, that's something that brings a little extra special meaning to Bridge Day for me, and kind of helps keep me going to do this, because, it's a lot of effort and a lot of work to put this thing on. And it's also a huge responsibility safety-wise. It has a special place in my heart because this is my hometown. Bridge Day is the oldest and longest running single-day extreme sports event on the planet. That's significant if you start thinking about it. 40 plus years we've been doing this thing here in this little town you grew up in, and worldwide it has huge implications on extreme sports events and just large public events as a whole. So it's been an honor for me to be a part of it, and I hope to keep doing it for as long as I can.
This was Dylan Neal and Noah Fox with Inside Appalachia.
Dylan Neal and Nella Fox were media students at the Fayette Institute of Technology in West Virginia. This was their first radio story. This is from the opening sequence of a film called King Cole by Appalachian filmmaker Elaine McMillian Sheldon.
Papa always said that every new beginning starts with an end. It's been true for us, living our lives here in this place, a place of mountains and myths.
King Cole is a blend of documentary and imaginative storytelling that asks us to consider the past, present, and future of coal communities in the region. King Cole was screened at Sundance last year. It also showed at the Big Ears Festival in Knoxville, Tennessee. That's where I spoke with Sheldon and two of her collaborators on the film. I'll let them introduce themselves.
I'm Elaine McMillian Sheldon. I'm the director of King Cole.
My name's Molly Bourne. I am a co-producer on King Cole.
My name is Shodike Talaferro, musician, professional beatboxer, vocal percussionist, breath artist.
Breath art plays a big part in the soundscape of King Cole. But first, I asked Sheldon about a particular scene in the movie that took my breath away. I love this film. I mean, it showed an Appalachia that I'm very familiar with. It showed the Appalachia that I know. But it also showed an Appalachia I don't know. So my first question is, how did you get that incredible coal mining footage?
That was when I was making the Project Hollow in 2012 in McDowell County. And I had been trying to get access to a mine over and over and over and just kept getting shut down. Nobody wanted me to film. And that mine actually was one that I think my brother and my dad both worked at separate times. And so they were able to help me build the trust there. I was allowed to witness one shift, basically. We go into the mine. We see Bobby Lee, who's the miner, operating a continuous miner, which is a massive piece of machinery that he stands away from with a remote control and controls all of it while he's looking over his back, making sure the coal is going back in the right direction and not, that he's not pinning someone against the wall. With that type of machinery, basically, it's just a really violent scene where the machine is just crunching into this earth and just going at it. And I don't think most people know what that looks like, but it's loud, it's dusty, it's wet because they're spraying so much water to keep the dust down. And it's a really intense job. And it shows you how on edge miners can get. So with that, we get out of the mine and then we go into the garden with my papa, where I tell a story, which is very true, not just for my papa, but for everybody that's worked in the mines, that you just don't sneak up behind them because they've lived a life where they have been scared of getting pinned by rock or rock falling on them or whatever. And it's one of my favorite sequences because it shows both this very aggressive experience that people have, and then this gentleness that they occupy when they're above ground, just as human beings, like tending their gardens. And I think that juxtaposition is true for a lot of people that do that work, that they often aren't seen for that, you know.
Can you all talk a little bit about how you kind of initially conceived this through these scenes, and through the journalistic aspect, and kind of how it came together to make what we saw on the screen last night?
I don't know how it started, but we were both interested in these expressions of coal-related culture, these objects, these places. And I remember being aware of these for years. Like, my best friend in high school had a coal miner's daughter bumper sticker on her car. We've always seen these emblems and these expressions of pride. But then we've also seen these events, these really, like, these places where people come together in the community to talk about this place that we don't often see. Like, I have never been in a coal mine except for the exhibition coal mine where we filmed, and the one in Lynch, Kentucky as well. This is a world that many of us only know peripherally, or we don't know at all. And I think the events get at that complexity as well. Like the scene in the classroom where Fred Powers is talking about his experience underground, and there's that moment where he's talking about the methane explosion.
It's the most dangerous job in the coal mines, and it pays top dollar, because you go down in a place, and there's a place about as big as this room, and I was sitting towards the back of my machine, and I rumped down on it. I'm gonna go out and get me a load. And I rumped down on it and getting ready to swing out there to get me a load, and whoom, big methane explosion happened and come right in front of me. Man, 2 more seconds, and I would have been right into that thing. And I heard if a miner gets caught in a methane explosion, it'll burn all the skin off your body, eyeballs out of your socket, and most likely you're going to be body parts.
I mean, there's some levity in the way that he is talking about it, but it's also really tragic. And then later in that scene, a kid asks him, "Do you miss being a coal miner?" And he says, "Yes, I do." And he says it without missing a beat, and that captures that complexity, I think. The film started as us capturing these real life moments, so as a verite documentary, and then so we started filming in 2019, and when COVID hit in 2020, like many film teams and like everyone else, we stopped working for a bit, and so many of the coal events that we filmed before the pandemic did not come back. So that was an interesting and I think really special thing that we captured a lot of these moments as a living archive. But you were really interested in bringing in your family's experience, and it shifted into this, what has been described as an essay film or an experimental film, a hybrid documentary. And I think it needed to become that to say what we needed to say.
It was all really exciting to film because it was real and it was so heartfelt. And it was also all very ironic. And we really felt like it was lacking the context of understanding the psychology. And psychology is impossible to show. The psyche is an impossible thing to show. So we had to think of other ways, cinematic techniques, dreamscapes, other things to take us into that realm that would make this more universal and not an oddity. I think that the people at the center of it and their resilience has always been what's interesting to both of us, and their dignity, right? And their choice to stay, and how difficult that's been. And usually they're depicted as not having choice. And so I think we wanted to show people as actually making a choice to stay.
How did you start working with Shotake?
The sound team is made of all stars, including Shotake. Last year at Big Ears in Knoxville, where I live, Shotake came to perform. I just almost fell off my seat because I didn't even know what he was doing with his mouth to make these sounds that sounded like nature and sounded like life and death and all these things, all the themes of the film, and I just was blown away. I didn't know what he did was even a thing, but when I heard it, I knew the film couldn't live without it.
Would you mind explaining a little about what breathwork is? Maybe like a short demo?
Right, okay, so some of the sounds that I provided for the film for musical composition purposes are as follows. So wind sounds like this. And then there are a lot of sounds where it's clearly identified as human breath. So inhalations and gasps. And then, this is another standout method or technique. I call it overtone breath. And there's a warbling effect that sits at the center of the vocal technique and sound experience of it. It sounds like this.
That was Shodike Talaferro, Molly Bourne, and Elaine McMillian Sheldon. The film King Cole makes its national broadcast premiere this month on PBS. For more, check your local listings. King Cole will be available to stream until December 3rd on pbs.org and the PBS app. Till next time, thanks for joining us as we journey throughout Appalachia. Our theme music is by Matt Jackford. Other music this week was provided by Jeff Ellis, Noam Pickleney, Joe Dobbs and the 1937 Flood, Sierra Farrell, and John Blessard. Bill Lynch is our producer. Xander Alloway is our associate producer. Our executive producer is Eric Douglas. Kelly Libby is our editor. Our audio mixer is Patrick Stevens. We had help this week from Folkways editor Mallory No Pain. You can find us on Instagram and Twitter @InAppalachia. You can also send us an email to insideappalachia@wvpublic.org. Visit wvpublic.org/InsideAppalachia to subscribe or stream all of our stories. Or look for Inside Appalachia on your favorite podcast app. Inside Appalachia is a production of West Virginia Public Broadcasting.
Support for Inside Appalachia is provided by Concord University, educating the people of our region and beyond for more than 150 years. More information at concord.edu.